Okay, so hi everyone, and welcome to what I have to say. Of course, I love all of the sessions that happen at ICFP. All of them are fantastic and valuable for the field. This one I think is going to be different from most of the others. So this is a debate format on low fertility. And so unlike the other format of the sessions at ICFP, this one will involve two teams of two people each who will be talking about low fertility and engaging in rigorous academic and practical debate. So in terms of the overall format, we're going to start with a poll that I think will, great. So you should see up here on the slide up front that there is a Mentimeter poll that allows you to first weigh in on your thoughts on low fertility before we start the debate. So the way this is going to work is we'll have you complete this poll first, and we'll show the results. And then after we have the debate, we'll do the same poll to see if your opinion changed, thereby being able to evaluate which team of debaters was more effective in convincing all of you on the outcomes of low fertility and the consequences of low fertility. So it looks like we should be all set, so maybe I'll call the panelists to join us up on stage. So please come up on stage and you'll have a second to introduce yourself. And actually, while they're coming up, maybe I can just go over the format in a little bit more detail. So as I mentioned, you all have the Mentimeter quiz that hopefully you were able to answer. So we have some baseline indication about how people feel about low fertility. Then after I finish with these comments, and we have brief introductions from the panelists, then we'll flip a coin to decide which team goes first. And then side one, whoever wins the coin flip, will have one panelist give a 8-minute opening statement on their side about low fertility, and followed by equal 8 minutes from the second side, and they're one panelist. And then the second panelist from each of those sides will have a chance for a nuanced statement to add on to their original argument. And then after that, after all four members go and give their discussion points on low fertility, we'll have a 3-minute break that will allow for the audience to ask questions and allow for panelists to put together thoughts and put together their rebuttals to the arguments of the others. After that 3-minute break, we'll get back together, and each side collectively will have 5 minutes for a rebuttal, and then we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A from the audience with equal times for both sides. And then closing statements for each side will have 2 minutes apiece for closing statements. So I hope you're all as excited as I am for this. This is, I would say demography at its finest, and we're very fortunate to have a group of 4 panelists who are perfectly suited to discuss this critical topic for us. So now maybe I can go sequentially to the panelists and have you give just really brief introductions of who you are. So Sabrina?
Good afternoon. Yeah, good afternoon. Greetings, everyone. Pleasure to be here. My name is Sabrina Juran. I am the Regional Advisor for Data and Population Dynamics at the UNFPA's Regional Office for Latin America and the Caribbean. And with me...
Hello, everyone. My name is Nandita Bajaj, and I'm the Executive Director of Population Balance, which is a U.S. nonprofit organization working on the connections between pronatalism, population, and ecological overshoot.
Hello, everyone.
Okay, so now that the participants have introduced themselves, we'll move on to the coin toss. So The yes team gets to choose the coin, the coin toss. I have the coin right here. So could I have one member from the yes team come up here, please? All right. So I will show everyone the coin. It is a Panamanian coin, reflecting the region. And so we'll say this is heads. Yes. The plus is heads. The shield is tails. Right? Heads. Tails. All right. So I'm going to flip it. Call it in the air.
Tails.
All right. Okay. So that means the no team will go first. All right. So the no team has won the coin toss. The drama has already started. And now I will keep strict time and turn it over to the no team for an 8-minute opening statement. Yes.
If you don't mind, I'm somewhat smaller than Phil, so I have to adjust your computer and the mics. Can I take this computer away?
Started.
Oh, please. Can I put this computer away? All right. Okay. Let me be clear from the start. Falling fertility rates are not in and of themselves a crisis. Yes, lower fertility and changes in population size and structure will bring real changes to economies, labor markets, cities, and care systems. But calling it a crisis distorts the picture. It risks confusing symptoms with causes and leads us to fixate on fertility rates rather than asking whether our symptoms are adapting. A smaller population doesn't automatically lead to collapse. What matters is participation, inclusion, and whether people are supported to live, work, and care with dignity. So the problem is not that people are choosing smaller families or no children at all. The problem is that our economies and our social models haven't evolved to match those choices. So the crisis is when couples, and especially women, lack access to decide if, when, and how many children to have, or to form a family at all. The crisis is when reproductive decisions are not guided by choice, but shaped by insecurity, inequality, or fear. The crisis is when some groups are denied to the right to parenthood because of who they are, while others are expected to reproduce out of duty and not desire. So the crisis is that we are willing to sacrifice people's rights for the sake of numbers. And we have spent the last 3 decades since the ICPD and Cairo fighting to put people and not numbers, not targets, at the center of development. And so to fear low fertility is to fear the very realization of those rights. And now, in the face of demographic change, we are seeing intensified efforts to roll back those rights, to coerce, to shame, to pressure women and couples in the name of national interest or economic panic. And that isn't new. Control over women's reproduction has been part of the story for thousands of years. What's different now is that women globally, visibly, are refusing to comply. And that refusal is met with backlash. And that's a crisis. So let's reframe the narrative. Fertility decline is not a failure. It is the result of success, of expanding education, of expanding gender equality, of improved child survival and access to contraception, and empowering people to make their own reproductive choices. And UNFPA's State of the World Population Report shows clearly, in many countries there is a gap between how many children people want and how many they have, because systems haven't evolved to support their reproductive choices. And while some struggle to have the children they want, others face pressure to have children they never wanted. And both realities stem from the same problem, a lack of reproductive agency. And the barriers are not only economic. The barriers are structural and relational, and they shape how people feel economically, socially, environmentally, and even geopolitically when deciding whether to bring a child into the world. And even the idea of a desired family size must be unpacked, because desires don't exist in a vacuum. They are shaped by norms, by pressure, by expectations, and they also change over time. And here's the paradox. In many low and middle income countries, there is still a demographic dividend to harness. Young populations with immense potential and the most effective policy lever we have is closing the youth gap in the labor markets. Yet, investments in education, investments in care system and decent work remain utterly insufficient. But we are obsessing about birth rates. And there's also a paradox in high-income countries. As populations age more rapidly and workforces shrink, the challenge is not fertility decline itself, but the lack of adaptation, the failure to value and invest in care as essential infrastructure, to think of true integration of migrants, to ensure affordable housing, and to sustain progress in gender equality and work-life balance. If we truly believe in rights-based development, low fertility is not a threat, it's a signpost of agency. And in many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, 80% of people who are not employed or education are women, and not because they're not working, but because they're working unpaid, caring for children, caring for the elders, or caring for the households. And we still have the audacity to ask them to have more children without transforming the systems that are failing to support their aspirations in work, in care, and in autonomy. So instead of trying to fix women or pressure them or us to reproduce, we must fix the systems with policies that are holistic, that are sufficient in their level of support, that are long-term, respectful of diverse family forms, and supportive of individual rights and choices, including the choice to not have children at all if desired. And by not doing so, we would only be deepening old ones or old crises and not creating new ones, because we are reinforcing inequalities. We're ensuring that women, especially the most vulnerable, are aging into poverty with no pension, with no protection, and no recognition for a lifetime of invisible labor, and still we blame women. So we frame this as a failure of women to reproduce, but what we are actually witnessing is a failure of systems, legal, economic, health, and education systems to uphold reproductive agency. And that is a failure of policy, and that is not a failure of individuals. And we're also seeing dangerous pushback. We're seeing financial incentives to have children that are tied to traditional gender norms. We see bans on comprehensive sexuality education in school. We see restrictions on access to contraception. All of these are not just ineffective, they are harmful from a human rights perspective and even counterproductive. So no, falling fertility rates are not in and of themselves the crisis. The crisis is when a girl is forced into marriage or forced into motherhood before she is ready. The crisis is when someone wants a child but cannot access care or cannot afford to raise one in dignity. The crisis is when someone wants children but doesn't want children but is pressured, persuaded, or punished for that decision. The crisis is when we measure a country's success by the number of births instead of whether people's rights, needs, and aspirations are fulfilled. And that's what we should be debating. Thank you.
All right. Excellent work by team number one. Now I'd like to, without further ado, call team number two to join us up on the podium. This one works, that one I'm not so sure, so maybe try
Okay. Good afternoon. Yeah. So I'm here to convince you that we should fear falling birth rates. As a global community, we should all fear falling birth rates. Today, low fertility is a problem for high and middle income countries, where total fertility rate is already below replacement. However, in a few decades, emerging economies and low and middle income countries will be in the place that many high income countries are today. And so, even though total fertility rate was about 5 children per woman in 1950, it's about 2.5 now, and it's expected that by 2050, it will be like 1.8 globally. So we should fear falling rates. And why? First of all, the shrinking workforce and a decline in economic growth. When you have fewer children per woman or per couple, it implies fewer people will enter the workforce. And when you have fewer people in the workforce shrinks, and there will be slower economic growth. Additionally, with fewer youth in the workforce, there will be less innovation and less creativity because both of these require energy, and they require the willingness to take risks. And older people are risk averse, and so there will be a reduction in innovation, a reduction in creativity, further shrinking economic growth. If the current trends in the fertility decline continue for the next several decades, population age structures will start to invert as the once youth bulge and working age population that constituted the window of opportunity for a demographic dividend will transition to old age dependency. Japan's economic performance over the last 25 years is a very good example of what we can expect to see moving forward, where output per capita has increased, and so on average, people are more productive, but the total output growth has slowed down due to population decline. Other high-income countries may toe this line as well. Even though automation can fill some of these gaps, we know that machines will not pay taxes, they will not buy homes, they will not contribute to social life. Without population renewal, the economic and social engines falter, and this has huge implications on how to sustain social programs and public debt. A second argument related to that is the old age dependency. People are living longer. Japan and Hong Kong both have life expectancies of about 85 years. On the other hand, total fertility rate is at a record low of 1.5 children per woman in Japan in 2024, and in 2023, it was 1.2. So it's continuing to fall and has actually continued to fall for the last 9 years in Japan. So we should be afraid of falling birth rates. Women are marrying later, they're delaying childbirth, they're having fewer children, despite the government's policies to ease the financial burden of having children. And these include child-related subsidies as well as tuition-free high school in Japan. Even offering full pay during paternal leave has not made that much of a difference to the total fertility rate that continues to decline. Clearly, falling birth rates are concerning, and government policies do not appear to be able to stop the tide. An aging population will put fiscal strain on an already declining economy, with strains on pension systems. There are fewer contributors and more recipients. There's soaring social security and health care with an older population. And many of these people in the older population are also struggling with comorbidities, and so a lot of the available funds goes into keeping them well. This is not hypothetical. In Japan, data from the government suggests that over the past 2 decades, the number of individuals paying into the pension program has fallen by about 3 million people, while those benefiting from the pension scheme has increased by about 40%. How can this be sustainable? Falling birth rates are indeed a cause of concern, and this example from Japan is indeed a wake-up call. A third argument is a social argument. It's not only about the workforce and the economy. Low fertility weakens family networks and community ties. There'll be fewer young people to look after their aging relatives. Kinship relations will suffer, and this means that in low fertility settings, individuals will lose a well-known sense of stability, security, and belonging, and this may not be so good for mental health and mental well-being. Many people will no longer have a support system to depend on, and this is another consequence of low fertility. In fact, those who do not have siblings, who are the only child in their family, may be less well socialized than those who do have siblings. A fourth argument is a human rights argument. Low fertility translates to a small family size, but this may not be what couples want. Some people may be having fewer children as a reflection of the economy and the cost of bearing and rearing children, as well as uncertainty about what the future holds for their families and their nation. For these people, the decision to have fewer children is made unwillingly and thus infringes on their basic human rights to decide when and how many children to have. Even with supportive policies, it will be very difficult for any government to be able to bear the full cost of raising children. Evidence suggests that the effect of these policies in raising birth rates is minimal at best. So, low fertility continues to be a problem, and we must fear falling birth rates. The fifth argument has to do with anti-immigration policies. Many high-income countries do not seem to want to take in migrants, and when they do, their policies show selective immigration. Japan, South Korea, and Italy already face stagnant economies and labor shortages. So adding on restrictive migration policies and limited opportunities for migrants to fully integrate makes it clear that migration will not solve the problem of declining birth rates and a shrinking workforce. The last argument I'd like to make has to do with artificial intelligence. AI will not come to the rescue. The social problems countries will face due to falling fertility, such as the need for old age care, require skills like making a bed, like taking care of the elderly, skills that require the human touch and not a programmed machine. According to Moravec's paradox, tasks that are relatively easy for human beings, like perception and mobility, are difficult for machines. But tasks that are easy for machines, like high-level reasoning and computation, can be relatively difficult for human beings. For problems of low fertility settings, like who will look after the well-being of aging populations, machines will not be of much help. And so I'll leave you with this. As a global community, we should all fear falling birth rates, because this is associated with a shrinking workforce, a decline in economic growth, and many of the other points I've made. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the argument from team number 2. Now, I'd like to go back to the first team, and they have another 8 minutes for a nuanced or expanded statement.
Hi, everyone. So just to reiterate, global population is going up, not down, projected to hit a peak of 10.3 billion in the 2080s. But in many places in the world, it's true that fertility rates are falling and the median age is rising. These are two of the most positive trends in our recent history, reflecting greater reproductive choice for women and the fact that people are living longer and healthier lives. So why are these gains portrayed by many political leaders and media outlets as disasters? Such negative framing is not only harmful for individual rights, as it has already opened the door to coercive pronatalist policies, but it also completely ignores the seriousness of our ecological crises that are directly tied to the exponential growth in human activity. Given these harms, we may ask, who benefits from a constantly growing population, and why are they so afraid that fertility rates are declining? It's those in positions of power who rely on women's reproductive labor to grow the number of laborers, consumers, religious followers, taxpayers, and soldiers. This is a very, very old story. It started with the rise of patriarchy about 5,000 years ago. Humans have been around for about 300,000 years, and for most of that time, our population remained under 5 million. That's less than the population of Bogotá. But with the rise of city-states and empires 5,000 years ago, everything shifted. Elites needed population growth to strengthen state power, so women were disempowered and manipulated into having as many children as possible. Women systematically started to lose the agency and reproductive autonomy they had enjoyed in the largely egalitarian societies that had previously existed. And pronatalism, the coercive and subtle pressures for children and large families, became institutionalized. And with millennia of history behind it, pronatalism has become the proverbial water we're swimming in today. From religious messages to be fruitful and multiply, and pressures from family for grandchildren, to celebrity gossip about the latest baby bump, and the unrelenting media coverage about women not having enough babies. Pronatalism is patriarchy's most successful project. Our population has been growing since the rise of early states, from a few million to over 8 billion today. Much of this growth has happened on the backs of the most vulnerable women and girls. Research consistently shows that wherever and whenever women have greater self-determination through education and access to contraception, they choose to have fewer or no children, and birth rates fall. Yet hundreds of millions of women and girls are not allowed to make such choices. More than 640 million women and girls alive today were child brides. Over 220 million women worldwide have an unmet need for contraception. More than half of all pregnancies are unintended. That's 121 million each year worldwide. These are results of state, economic, and religious forces that rely on women and girls remaining disempowered. The ecological and human costs of this growth have been devastating. Population growth, along with an exponential rise in consumption, has pushed us into extreme ecological overshoot. Humans already demand 80% more from Earth than it can sustain, and that number is rising, resulting in climate breakdown, mass extinction, massive food insecurity, and rising global toxification. Extreme climate events alone are expected to claim the lives of at least 2 billion people and displace up to 3 billion people this century. And most of these people live in countries where women and girls are already disempowered and fertility rates remain high. And we cannot ignore the hell we are unleashing on the natural world. Species are going extinct 1,000 times faster than natural extinction rates. We've lost 70% of wildlife in just the last 50 years. In the words of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, quote, "Humanity is waging war on nature. This is suicidal. Human activities are at the root of our descent toward chaos, and only human action can help to solve it," end quote. And are we heeding these warnings? No. Instead of welcoming declining fertility rates as a triumph in reproductive rights and a pathway toward a more sustainable population, those in power are panicking that our population growth might come to an end this century. After all, fewer people means fewer cheap laborers for elites to exploit, fewer consumers for corporations, fewer soldiers for nation-states, and fewer followers for religious institutions. For example, Elon Musk, one of the wealthiest people in the world, has said, quote, "Population collapse due to low birth rates is a bigger risk to civilization than global warming," end quote. He argues that birth control is to blame and has emboldened and financed ethno-nationalist and eugenics-inspired pronatalist propaganda. US President Donald Trump calls himself the fertilization president and says he wants a baby boom. Russia's President Vladimir Putin has said, quote, "Large families must become the norm, a way of life for all of Russia's people," end quote. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has said, quote, "We don't just want numbers, we want Hungarian babies. Migration for us is surrender, end quote. People in power don't just stop with words. The number of countries with explicitly pronatalist policies driven by anti-immigrant, nationalist, or economic interests has tripled in the last 50 years. These include tax incentives and baby bonuses, restrictions on contraceptives and abortion, and bans on free speech about choosing to be child-free, including proposals to take away voting rights for people without children. This is not new. Institutions have been oppressing women for thousands of years, but the reason there is such a vicious backlash to declining fertility rates today is because women globally are refusing to comply, and no amount of pronatalist scheming is working to reverse this trend. Across all geographies, all levels of income, all religious settings, and all levels of education, one thing is clear. Once women achieve reproductive freedom, they choose fewer children and birth rates decline. And they are not likely to give up that freedom for nationalist, religious, or economic goals. So the lower fertility trend is here to stay. Admittedly, it has big implications for our economies and other systems predicated on the Ponzi scheme of endless growth. But the solution is not to try and reverse it by continuing to coerce women into having more children. Instead, we must adjust and adapt to this deep change with new thinking. There is no shortage of great ideas, economic models based on well-being, social ecological democracy, degrowth. We need caring policies that promote healthy and active aging, reproductive agency, universal education and healthcare, meaningful employment, flexible work schedules, dignified care work, and a strong intergenerational safety net. Ultimately, to create a just and sustainable society that respects Earth's ecological integrity, we must reimagine our economies so our economies are here to serve us, not the other way around. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to Team 1. Now, finally, we have the last panelist to give their opening starting points. Looks good.
Okay, great. Great. So I'm an economist, so I'm going to make a very straightforward point about why we should fear low fertility from the economic point of view. I'm going to tell you some very unpleasant accounting exercises. There's an accounting reality. Total output growth, GDP growth, is a fundamental identity that is made up of two components: output per capita growth and population or labor growth. It's a sum of the two. Over history, the US in 2000 and over the past 20 years has been relying on a 3% growth rate in order to be able to finance public goods and services. Of the 3%, 2% of that growth was financed through labor productivity, output per capita, and 1% was relying on population growth. In a typical growth year, 3% is what we would expect. In a boom year, so when unemployment was low, when labor was particularly productive, we would expect 4%. In a depression year, we would expect 2%. In the future, regardless of how population changes in the US with momentum and what Japan experiences today, we would expect 1% growth rates. Why? 2% labor productivity, but a negative 1% growth rate because of population decline. So in a boom year, you would expect 2% growth, but in a depression year, you would expect 0% growth. And this, by the way, is irrespective of any fiscal or monetary policy, anything that the government can't do anything about this. This is what you would expect. What does this mean? So then what about output per capita? Isn't it all about how productive people are? Isn't it about human capital? Isn't it about productivity per person? Well, yes and no. Output per person is about individual welfare. But when we're talking about society, when we're talking about financing public goods and services, it's about output growth. I'm going to get more about this later. So then the question is, can't we get output per capita? Can we get productivity up higher? The answer is actually no. Historically, and what we see today in the data, we actually see much more concentration in firm dynamism. We see much more like stability and stagnation in technological innovation over time. Just an example with researchers, there are many more researchers, effective researchers over time, but the actual productivity in researchers has actually declined over time. So the overall growth rate in technological innovation has actually stagnated. What are the implications of low population growth and as a result, stagnant or low output growth? There's a direct financial damage to pay-ahead concepts to social welfare systems. Social security, safety net programs, social health insurance. All of this, in the absence of having large tax bases, will require either increases in tax eligibility or larger tax increases per person per capita. There's going to be a significant decline, as Funmi mentioned, in entrepreneurship and innovation because you're going to have aging populations, and the largest bulk of innovation comes in youth and late working age populations. All social welfare systems and public goods where fixed costs are high, the government is the only source where public goods can be financed because it can borrow on future debt. So when you're thinking roads, when you're thinking water systems, when you're thinking infrastructure, those are all incredibly expensive in terms of fixed costs, and those are all offset in terms of their cost by large tax bases. All of them will be severely affected. We won't be able to finance them. Public education will go into complete fiscal crisis because not only is it incredibly expensive in terms of a large fiscal, in terms of fixed costs, but education is actually financed on a per pupil fiscal basis. So we're not only talking about like primary school education that is going to go into a fiscal spiral, but also higher education. And since we're all in public health here, public health will be completely needing to be restructured because as we talk about population decline, we've been already mentioning aging populations. It costs about 4 times more to finance the elderly particularly in terms of their health care, relative to youth dependence, and all of the benefits that are accrued through the demographic dividend will all have to be refinanced and restructured to finance and support the aging in terms of elderly age consumption relative to all of the benefits that they would have brought in terms of investment. So related to the losses from the demographic dividend, right? We were talking about all the benefits from youth momentum and all of the productive benefits that would confer from that, from those working age cohorts. All of the gains from those windows of opportunity that we've been discussing at this conference would all, when they were net producers, would all have to be dissolved and absorbed back to finance consumption in old age. This would mean lower savings and lower consumption and therefore higher interest rates. So therefore, for any of the youth and the working age populations that would need to borrow to start financing homes, to start investing when they're in working age, it would be much more expensive to invest. This leaves far less, for example, in budgets for governments to finance anti-poverty programs, climate and the environment, because there's just far less of a tax base and also far less for environmental and public service programs, which the elderly care far less about. We know this from the data. This also leaves far less of a budget for childcare, family support programs, and equity programs, empowerment programs, the very same policies that might have addressed fertility decline to begin with. And from a political economy perspective, the electorate, as a result of an elderly and aging population, will shift more towards a gerontocracy, where older voters, not only because they disproportionately vote more, but they also will constitute a much larger section and a proportion of the voting age share, will be taken into account. So everybody will be voting more disproportionate towards the elderly. Everybody's been talking about migration. What about migration? This is not a solution, not even in the intermediate term. Fertility around the world is falling, and as far as I know, there's no net migration into Earth. That's 0. So the number of immigrants that countries with fast declining populations to date that they would need to bring in to offset the population losses is unrealistically high. And that has already been mentioned, given the current geopolitical climate and a reversion around anti-immigrant nationalistic attitudes, implementing such liberal immigration policies is just infeasible. We had already mentioned Japan having a falling fertility, incredibly limited migration, and anemic growth over the past 20 years of about 0.83%. This is probably the most optimistic scenario where Japan had incredibly overexported growth. That's probably because they were able to over and buffer their growth scenario. But if we think about Colombia, since we're here, Colombia has incredibly severe outmigration currently to the US and Spain, and similar low and middle income countries, governments might not have the fiscal margins to maneuver in the same way that Japan has been able to even being able to have net positive growth over the past 20 to 25 years. So the question was, should we fear low fertility? Based on just the economic argument alone, not the equity argument, not the empowerment argument, the social argument, if we do not already fear low fertility and its implications, we should at least be incredibly, incredibly concerned. Let alone, before we even talk about the potential policy responses, all the policy and practical responses to addressing low fertility. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Excellent. So now we're done with the first phase of this session. At this point, we're going to have a 3-minute break. During this break period, the panelists have some time to prepare rebuttal arguments for the other side. And meanwhile, participants online can write in questions into the chat that they're using to connect to the conference with. And all of the participants here in person, please think of some questions yourself that you'd like to ask. If there's a question that you'd like to ask, you can maybe raise your hand, and our colleague Apurva here will be coming around to tables to collect questions if you have them. After this break, Team 2, so Mahesh and Fumi, you go first with 5 minutes for a rebuttal argument, followed by Team 1 with 5 minutes after that. So I will start the timer now, and we have 3 minutes. All right. Panelists, the time is up. Ahem. All right, Mahesh and Fumi, it's over to you, and you have 5 minutes.
Should I? Okay. Great. So our points in terms of the rebuttal are as follows. There were a lot of policies that were discussed, particularly around policy responses that have been either currently implemented or in the process of implemented or that might be implemented. There was mentions about Musk and Trump and Putin and all of the unfavorable policies around pronatalism. And I think from our perspective, we agree with them. But those are policy responses to the fundamental problem, which is still low fertility. And so the problem, we argue, still exists, that like the problem is still low fertility. And so that kind of makes our point. Secondly, each one of these policies that are mentioned and all of the policy solutions around promoting equity, promoting women's empowerment, promoting childcare, promoting equitable labor market participation, promoting equitable opportunities, they all require public good financing services, public goods and services. They require redistributive policies. They require equitable redistribution. They require tax bases. So my fundamental question would be, where's the money coming from? I would also ask, when women have had the choice, right? When we're talking about choices in terms of fertility, when we're talking about choices in terms of ideal and desired family size, we see historically, and we see even contemporaneously, as women become empowered, they have had the choice to have fewer children. They choose to delay childbearing, and as a result, in aggregate, as individual choice increases, as women's empowerment increases, when we aggregate that up, there are fewer dependents, smaller tax bases, and therefore less financing for public goods and services for society. So therefore, we end up in the same problem. Again, we would ask, where does the public goods and financing for services come from? I will pause there and turn it over to Funmi.
The other team argued that women are coerced to have children that they don't want to have. Choice is important, and we're not arguing against choice. But as Mahesh has said, the sequelae remain the same. And so it's not really a question of reproductive rights and choice or coercion. It's a question of facing the facts. Women are choosing, when they can, to have fewer children. And so fertility continues to fall. The policies do not seem to be making much of a difference. Perhaps they're just too little, too late. And so Japan is struggling today. It may be the US tomorrow. In decades to come, low and middle income countries, such as sub-Saharan African countries, will also face this same problem of low fertility. We should be concerned. Low fertility is something we do need to think about. And indeed, falling birth rates are something we should fear.
Okay, thank you very much, Fumi and Mahesh. Now, we can turn it over to Team 1. Please join us up here, and you have 5 minutes for your rebuttal argument.
So the main arguments brought forward by our colleagues were primarily economics-based, which is concerning. As we have established, this economic model is based on a Ponzi scheme that requires an endless growth in population and consumption. Do we really want to maintain an economic model that primarily enriches the elites and treats the rest of us as labor inputs? But we know that our economy is not going to change overnight, so we are going to also offer some counter-arguments for what we can be doing within this current model while it makes its way to adaptation. First, the old age dependency ratio concept that was brought about by our colleagues. The concern that was raised was as fertility rates are declining, there will be fewer working age people to support the costs of pensions and age-related health care for an aging population. But these are also based on faulty assumptions. Old age dependency ratio is a concept that came about 75 years ago when things were dramatically different. It's a ratio between people aged 60 and over who are considered dependents to those 15 to 59 who are considered working age. This metric fails to acknowledge all that's happened in the last 75 years. A 65-year-old today is not old and is likely working and active in most older societies. Plus, as fertility rates have declined, female labor participation has greatly increased. So the ratio is actually a lot smaller than it's assumed to be. In fact, research shows that among the 36 countries in the OECD, there is no relation between older societies and labor shortages. The second issue is that not all working age people are actually working. In most countries, there are high rates of chronic and unemployment due to discrimination, especially among seniors, people with disabilities, people of color, youth, women, and migrant workers. History shows that as labor markets tighten, employers are forced to offer higher wages, benefits, and working conditions for employees. This not only enables people across all groups to gain meaningful employment, it also helps to improve economic equality and personal and social well-being. And the third thing is that because people are living longer and healthier lives, they do not require intensive health care until the last several years of their lives. So age-related health costs don't end up being as high as they are made out to be. A question was brought up around innovation. Actually, I have one more thing to say on this. We have to ask, how does adding more people now support the large number of older people help this situation? It doesn't, because adding young people requires significant investment. Young people don't stop being dependents when they're 15. Young people are continuing on their education until they're at least 25, and they don't start paying into the labor force well into their 20s or 30s, and that is an investment. So there's a very good opportunity there to redirect a lot of that money toward age-related care. And we have not talked about the grossness of the fact that the top 1% of the global population holds more wealth than the bottom 95% of the world put together. Shouldn't we be looking at opportunities for investing our wealth more efficiently, including in essential services like healthcare, education, and social security? Did you want to add? Or should I go to the next one? If you want to. The question about innovation was also brought up, that with fewer young people, we are not as innovative a society. The thing that it misses there is innovation is not just about the number of people. It's about the number of people who have access to educational and employment opportunities to fulfill their highest potential. According to UNESCO, there are over 250 million children globally who are not in school, most of them in low-income countries where fertility rates still remain high. Both UNICEF and ILO also show that these are also places with high rates of child marriage and child labor. There's a tremendous missed opportunity to invest not just in children's basic rights to health and education by banning child marriage and child labor practices, but also the innovation potential they bring.
Okay. Perfect time.
Thank you.
Great. So now for the next segment, now that both teams have had a chance to give their opening initial arguments and rebuttals to the other side, we have 15 minutes for questions from all of you. So we'll be going around among you with the microphone, and you have a chance to ask questions to the participants to help either bolster their arguments or confirm, some questions that you might have about their arguments. I'll be keeping strict time. This is 15 minutes long, and after that, each team has 2 minutes for a closing statement.
Hi, Chris Purdy with DKT. Thank you for your presentations. When we saw the poll at the beginning, we saw that most people were saying that you should not be afraid of declining fertility, and the math is pretty clear that it's going to be declining. So the question I have for everybody is, at what point do you start to get worried about this, right? Because the math, if we follow the math, at some point it's going to be 9 billion, then 8, and then 6, and then 3, then 2. Then so when do we, as a community, say, well, maybe it's time to start getting worried about this, or is it just all the way down to zero, if you follow the math? That's the first question. The second question is, what kind of language do you think that we as the leaders in reproductive health, what kind of language should we be using to talk about this in a way that doesn't be fear-mongering, but that we can own it instead of the Elon Musks of the world? Thank you.
So thank you for the question. I think, unfortunately, there's a little bit of a weird echo here. So I think probably everyone out there heard your question, Chris, but I'm not sure everyone up here did. So Chris, if I could ask you maybe just to come up to the front and speak your question again directly without the microphone, to the folks here. Thank you.
So the question is, we all know the math is going down, but at what point should we start to get worried? Is it at 9 billion? Is it 7? Is it 1 billion? Right? Math is going to eventually get us all the way down. And so when do we start to get worried as a community that it is something to be concerned about? The second question is, what kind of language do you think that we as leaders in reproductive health should be using to own this conversation instead of letting Elon Musk and others define it for us? Thank you.
I think maybe let's give 1 minute to each side to answer that question. Team 2 started off last time. Now let's start off with Team 1. So if you'd like to give a quick response to that question, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. The question about at what point should we start worrying if the populations decline too much, I will say one thing, that as a species, out of millions of other species, the growth in population and consumption that we have experienced in the last 200 years, which is from 1 billion to 8 billion, factor of 8 in population, a factor of 100 in consumption, is unprecedented for our species in the last 300,000 years. A lot of ecologists call this an anomaly, an abnormality for a species. No other species has dominated the rest of the planet this way. So I wouldn't be too worried, given that we have been around for 300,000 years with a population of less than 5 million and thrived to the point that we're here. I wouldn't be too worried about population declining to a level that's not sustainable. Do I have a few more seconds? Okay.
That was a All right, thank you. My second question actually comes from someone online. I want to make sure that we're acknowledging the online viewers too. This question is from Stan Becker. 5 groups of ecologists have estimated that the planet can only support sustainably less than 4 billion people. We are 8 billion now, living off the capital of the planet. And the UNPD says we are projected to reach 10 billion by about 2080. So should we not welcome population decline?
I believe we already answered that. We should definitely be celebrating fertility rate declines, not just for the reproductive agency and gains in reproductive autonomy it represents, but also because of the heading toward a more sustainable population. I've also heard similar numbers from other ecologists and demographers and economists even who have said, including Sir Partha Dasgupta, who has come up with a population anywhere from 1 to 4 billion. And that is the population. My grandmother is turning 100 next year, and she was born in 1926 when the population was 2 billion. So when she turned 50, the population was 4 billion, and with her 100th birthday, the population is 8 billion. So in one person's lifetime, we've seen a quadrupling of population. In the same way, I think we should welcome a natural, rights-based decline to population that is also not pushing us past all of the planetary boundaries, threatening our future.
Great. And 1 minute for team two. All right. I'm looking at the time, and I don't want to go too far over for the session, so unfortunately, I think we should cut questions off there.
Okay.
But next up, we have the closing statements from, let's start with Group 1. You have 2 minutes for a closing statement.
I have a closing statement of a minute, so I can weave in a minute of responses that I didn't get to the questions and answers. I think the narrative that we need to be leading from the international community is that based on rights, right? We don't want to only present economic arguments, especially economic arguments that are based on economies that were created for a different era and for different ambitions, and an era where women still cared unpaid, and an era where age also really meant decline, and where migration was feared. So I think just presenting sole, simplistic economic arguments is really dangerous. And I think we've seen that on stage today, and I think we hear that also in the narrative, and I think that's why we need to be committed to have a multisectoral, rights-based approach in our narrative as well. And I think similarly, what we heard from the other side, our policy responses do have an economic argument for sure, and they need to have. But they are not based in economy in itself. They are based in the commitment to increase the life chances of every individual so that every individual can live the life they have reason to value. And so I'm going to end by saying this.
You have 1 more minute.
Yeah, perfect. Low fertility rates are not a failure in itself. They are the result of freedom. They reflect a world where for the first time since the rise of patriarchy and the enemy of equality, millions of women can decide if and when to have children, and that should be celebrated. Change brings challenges, for sure, but the answer is not to fear the future, and it is to prepare for it with courage and with creativity. And that means redesigning our systems and not rewriting people's rights. And it means embracing longevity, not fearing aging. It means integrating migration, not resisting it. It means transforming care work, education to support real choices for women, for families, for individuals, for everyone. And it means building societies that respect ecological limits where people can thrive in balance with each other and with nature. So we do not need to go backward in order to move forward. We need to build societies where every life is valued, where every choice is respected, and where our systems catch up with the realities and with the rights of the peoples they are meant to serve.
Thank you very much, Team 1. Now, Team 2, you have 2 minutes for a closing argument.
Great. So there are some hard demographic and economic realities that we need to face. Falling fertility is not just about smaller families. It's about shrinking societies, collapsing labor forces, unsustainable age structures, and if recent and distant history has taught us anything, all of the strains to public policy and exacerbated inequality that these dynamics bring, and that the world has shown that it's just not prepared to face. Japan, South Korea, Italy already face these realities and show that the futures that the rest of the world might have to portend and face. We show that automation to date can fill some of these gaps, but as my colleague has already mentioned, machines don't pay taxes, they don't buy homes, they don't contribute to social life. And so without population renewal, the economic and social engines that we rely on falter, and the implications on social programs, public debt, and security are insurmountable. We have already mentioned about the implications on population aging. As societies age, risk aversion grows, innovation slows. We have implied the implications on low fertility on social cohesion, how it weakens family structures, social ties, community networks, and how historically we are a social species. We have related with each other, and we have relied on extensive relational connections. And low fertility brings about the loss of kinship relations and their benefits, and having few to low social support systems to count on. Low fertility does not necessarily help the environment, paradoxically so. Collapsing populations that we will experience, we will no longer have the budgets and the tax bases because of low fertility to generate, because of the fiscal problems that we'll have to combat. There will be no room in government budgets to be able to counter environmental concerns and social problems. So what are we left with? Declining fertility is not just a demographic curiosity, it's a structural shift with global consequences. And if I have to leave with any statement, sustainability without people is just not sustainability at all.
All right, well, this has been fantastic. I'd say that, first of all, let's give all of the panelists a round of applause for their fantastic discussion of this topic. I also want to take a second to thank the 4 panelists. We very much appreciate all 4 of you taking the time to engage in this really important debate. Just really quickly, when we were planning ICFP this year, I asked around to really the whole broad population of people who come to this conference what they wanted to talk about, and this was easily one of the top 5 topics that people wanted to discuss at ICFP this year. So again, thank you very much to the panelists for the discussion of this topic, which clearly is of great interest to the vast majority of people joining ICFP this year. Also, I want to note that the panelists were assigned a side between these two positions. So I want to be clear that the panelists these views do not necessarily reflect the pure, exact, accurate views that all the panelists might have. They may or they may not. So I just want to make sure that if you see someone in the hallway and you didn't agree with their argument, don't be hostile. Also like to thank Apurva Jadhav, who helped to plan the session as well, and especially created this Mentimeter quiz. Now, at the baseline, the Mentimeter quiz had to the question, should we fear falling birth rates? There were 11 votes of yes, 43 votes of no, and 11 votes of not sure. So that equals 17% yes, 17% not sure, and 66% no. So let's wait 1 second and see if and whether things change so we can award a winning side to this debate. All right, let's wait maybe 1 more minute for all answers to come in. right. Well, at this point, I think we have a clear winning side. Oh, wait, it moved. I think we have to call it at this point. Otherwise, we're going to be here for a long time. So it looks like if there was movement, it was towards the no bin. So congratulations to the no side for your victory. Thank you very much once again to the yes side for your fantastic arguments. And let's give another round of applause to everyone here. And finally, I'd like to, one quick announcement. If you're interested in low fertility or fertility as a debate overall, there's another session that starts right now, just after this one, which we designed that, specifically to sequentially follow this. And I believe it's in room VW, maybe? But in any case, double check your program. Is that VW? Yeah, good. Right next door. So please follow next door if you'd like to continue engaging in this discussion. And thanks very much for joining this session.